My paper is called Sex and the Limits of Solidarity, Google Mapping Mobile Women in 18th Century Paris. Every grad student has heard the same tired refrain from their peers returning home from holidays. Few family members get what I'm doing or want to know more. On this score, I consider myself lucky. Curiosity drove my dad to slog through sections of my dissertation, prompting questions like, is imbrication really a word? But how could I explain an individual chapter's argument and its mechanics to less patient friends, family, and undergraduate students, short of planting each person in a comfortable chair with a sheaf of paper? This problem nagged at me as I wrote about the role that urban geography played in reshaping sexual norms and exacerbating illegitimate pregnancy in 18th century Paris. I was particularly anxious to share my findings. That the unwed mothers in my sample demonstrated a striking degree of mobility that seemed to correspond directly with their failure to secure financial support from their babies' fathers. To illustrate these findings, I experimented with an idiom familiar to most, Google Maps. So on the less sophisticated side of the mapping spectrum, but still very useful. Beyond helping me communicate my findings to a more general audience, this digital tool also helps me answer questions, important questions, and address existing scholarship. More precisely, Google Maps helped me to uncover how expanding geographic orbits destabilize traditional safeguards against shame and scandal. David Garriock has rightly asserted that many Parisian neighborhoods function like villages, where residents were familiar with everyone's habits, moods, and daily movements. But an expanding subset of young, unmarried women existed at the fringes of those neighborhoods, alienated from networks of surveillance, support, and solidarity. By plotting actors in seduction cases, I realized that claimants' court failures owed primarily to their tenuous connections with witnesses rather than broader cultural antipathy toward unwed mothers. Accordingly, my paper argues that urban geography did undermine the power of community in 18th century Paris. So to take a step back, when I began writing my dissertation, I gave scant notice to the addresses that claimants and witnesses reported when they were filing complaints or giving testimony to police commissioners and clerks. In this respect, I was guilty of spatial neglect common to many historians. If maps have appeared in historical scholarship, Americanist Stephen Robertson writes, historians have until recently written about the past with little attention to space. Maps, Robertson continues, can reveal spatial patterns not evident from reading the texts. As an example, he points to the important project, it's called Visualizing Emancipation, which I recommend everyone look up, which connects emancipation events during the Civil War to geographic features like rivers and coastlines, as well as the Union Army's troop movements. Plotting these points helped researchers conclude that water and rail played pivotal roles in helping enslaved men and women reach freedom. Within my own field, Hélène Huet has used ArcGIS to demonstrate how Parisian neighborhoods begot collaboration within the late 19th century decadent movement. My own recent foray into digital mapping attempts to uncover more precise connections between mobility and sexual vulnerability. Social historians of 18th century France have firmly established the liminal social position of the femme seule, or woman alone. However, they have not mapped her movements to consider the spatial dimensions of that vulnerability. My own study of over 250 seduction cases in Paris concerns both migrant and Parisian women whose tenuous economic circumstances obligated them to move frequently within and around Paris. For both groups, steady employment rarely guaranteed stability and safety. Migrant women in particular remained shadowy entities to those among whom they worked. When one kitchen maid launched seduction charges, her fellow servants could scarcely say from whence she came, They refer to her arrival from her country, proffering no details apart from noting that she knew no one in Paris. None seemed keen to warn her about the male servant who took a shine to her and soon became her sole companion. None attempted to broker a reconciliation after she became pregnant and he left town to avoid marrying her. Such lack of solidarity likely stemmed from the instability within unskilled professions like service. In domestic service, average terms of employment lasted about 6 months to 1 year. Rapid turnover prevented many women from establishing durable relationships at work and in their surrounding neighborhoods. And now we can go to the first slide. The employment history of Anne Odo is a remarkable case in point. From her home in Champagne, Anne traveled a path to Paris, then north to Gisors, back to Paris, and then myriad places within Paris. So this is my first clumsy attempt at a map, but it lists all of the places she lived within 3 years on the left. I'm not wholly certain of the trajectory, which is why I have a question mark in some places, but the final location is a yellow star, and it's usually somewhere close to where the commissioner is, which is a gray balloon in all of these instances. In the span of only 3 years, she worked as a lady's maid for 4 different employers, with terms of service ranging between 1 and 18 months, and lodged in 4 separate rooms between periods of employment. The outcome? No single coworker testified on her behalf when she launched seduction charges against the valet de chambre, Claude Philippe Antoine Gros. Instead, 3 witnesses who worked in service with Gros testified because he had actually served the same person throughout that whole 3-year period, unlike her. So at very least, Odo benefited from the remarkable durability of her lover's employment. The majority of witnesses heard, 6 of 11 lived in the Hôtel d'Angoulême, where Odo lodged at the time of her complaint, so her very last residence on this map. All testified to a violent confrontation between the couple, but knew little else about their relationship. Of the remaining witnesses, only 2 spoke to the actual relationship, a fellow lodger from the Rue de Sèvres, as well as a friend from Champagne who happened to be in Paris on business. Her employers were conspicuously absent from the process, underscoring Sarah Mazza's claim that employers played less productive, benevolent roles in their servant lives by the latter half of the century. Lines of allegiances did not extend across class in Paris as they did in smaller cities and villages across France. You can go there. Yeah. The men whom migrant women identified as seducers seemed to purposefully exploit their position as outsiders. Some claimants explained that they had migrated to Paris at the insistence of young men who convincingly touted the city's opportunities. These seducers, they argued, sought to isolate unmarried women from their parents and family with the goal of gaining sexual access to them. Marie Thiellet, for example, faulted her alleged seducer for luring her to Paris to circumvent her parents' supervision. Louis Pacotte had frequently passed her father's pastry shop in Burgundy during his apprenticeship for the neighboring surgeon. So according to Thiellet, her parents posed obstacles to his nefarious designs. Pacotte persuaded Marie to leave home for a position as a lady's maid in Paris and gained her mother's blessing. But Marie had barely passed through the Porte Saint-Michel when Pacotte's attentions intensified and his promises of employment disintegrated. By then, Pacotte was at once her source of alienation and her sole resource for survival. Facing homelessness and dependence, Marie chose the latter course. Alienation from her home in Burgundy was not the sole source of Marie's misfortune. Her constant relocation within a succession of furnished rooms or chambres garnies prevented her from putting down roots in Paris. And this is some of the 14, I think, total residences she occupied in a very short period of time. I think 5 to 6 years, but it's approximate. Chambres garnies were small Spartan quarters, and they were ubiquitous in 18th century Paris. Merchants and wig makers rented them on short-term basis to travelers at exorbitant rates. According to Louis-Sébastien Mercier, they also housed women of ill repute. Prostitutes, he jauntily noted, kept nearly half these rooms constantly occupied. But the frequency with which both migrant and Parisian women occupied these very rooms suggests a more complex picture than Mercier allows, if you can believe that, which is usually the case with Mercier. Circumspect men of means paid rent on these rooms in a mock charitable move to their lovers, designed to secure unrestricted sexual access to vulnerable women, while separating them from networks of surveillance. By her own account, Marie Thiellet inhabited 14 separate rooms during her stay in Paris. Witness testimony substantiates these claims. Over the course of this period, she gave birth to 3 children, none of which Paquette would recognize as his own. Proprietors and fellow lodgers would later explain that they took Paquette at his word when he introduced himself and Thiellet as man and wife. However, witness testimony makes clear that Marie's near constant movement prevented her from reproducing the allegiances that she enjoyed back home in Burgundy. No neighbor or acquaintance intervened in her relationship with Paquette. You can go to the end, the empty one. Oh, there should be an empty one. Oh, that's okay. That's good. Oh, sorry, go back. Okay. Anne Roussel took a similar path. She lived with her parents in Versailles until Antoine Huguet, a graveur de musique and a Parisian, encouraged her to seek a position in Paris. Her parents consented to her departure. From there, Roussel occupied various rooms paid for by Huguet. From the Rue de Bourbon to the Rue Beaurepaire, Rue de Grenelle, Rue de la Jussienne, Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, back to Versailles for a spell, and then back again to Rue de la Jussienne. In the space of 3 years, she became pregnant twice, both times unbeknownst to her parents. Her constant movement not only kept them in the dark, it concealed the relationship from Huguet's mother. As one witness speculated, Huguet moved Roussel about to diffuse tension with his relatives, to whom he could claim that he had dissolved the relationship once and for all. Like other men, Huguet manipulated the ease of mobility to stymie both his lover's social networks and his own social network. And then the final, thank you. The path of Denise Richard also underscores the versatility of Chambres garnies as a means of manipulating urban geography to male advantage. And this slide doesn't show quite the same movement, but her first location is on the very same block as her lover. Then she moves slightly farther away, and then he moves across the Seine in a bid to ditch her. But I don't know exactly where, but he moves from that original location. Richard works as a maid at the Hôtel de Lusignan, where she encountered Sir Legris de la Bastide, a Marseillais friend of her employer who lodged at the nearby Hôtel de la Paix. After some time, La Bastide convinced Richard to abandon her position and relocate to a room at the Hôtel de la Réunion. This move was strategic. It eliminated the surveillance of her colleagues and acquaintances and sealed her dependence on her lover. Later, La Bastide re-established Richard in a room closer to his home on the Rue Grenier-Saint-Lazare, where they met more easily. But close proximity proved dangerous as her belly slowly began to protrude, and the Marseillais sought more distant quarters on the left bank. By then, the Chambres garnies served to create distance between La Bastide and his lover, whom he now wished to avoid. Richard herself was aware of this strategy, commenting to a neighbor that La Bastide found that she was too close to him. To her lover's cruel relief, Richard lost her baby in labor, whereupon La Bastide discontinued rent payments entirely. By then, her frequent movement had reduced the number of witnesses who could constitute her relationship with La Bastide. She reaped a mere 40 livres in damages. Why did women like Richard relocate to rented rooms at the risk of upending these networks of support and surveillance? Strategic sexual relationships, they promise lodging, food, and we can presume pleasure. Meanwhile, formal employment seemed to fail women who crept only incrementally close to amassing a dowry, while constantly deflecting sexual advances that imperiled their marriage prospects. The purported path to honor was laid with snares that traditional networks increasingly could not forestall. As Nina Kushner remarks, this grim reality led some women to realize that their sexuality was their most valuable possession. Some elected to enter the world of elite prostitution. Although by no means prostitutes, working women nevertheless operated within a spectrum of transactional sex. A broad range of behaviors separated two prominent extremes: the careful and chaste cycle of working and saving that was to lead to marriage, and its putative antithesis, street walking. Just as economic opportunity motivated migration to Paris, similar calculations motivated movement within Paris and prompted women to assume considerable risks by taking chambre garnie. Mobile women were plentiful in 18th century Paris. Economic need increasingly beckoned poor provincial women toward Paris and lured their Parisian-born peers beyond their parents' roofs. But standards of honor did not exactly adapt to this reality. Economic need and social vulnerability simply cemented a class dissociation between spatial mobility and sexual dissolution. As one defense lawyer put it, virtue is not ambulatory, and respectable girls do not run from town to town. Accused seducers likewise pointed to claimants' unsteady employment, independent lodgings, and acceptance of material gifts as evidence of prostitution, not poverty. Mapping these women's movements suggests that their alienation not only resulted in less favorable outcomes in seduction suits, diminished solidarity also prevented many Parisians from pushing back against spatial schemes of sexual honor that disadvantaged working women. These schemes persisted into the 19th century, complemented by bourgeois standards of sexual morality that demanded respectable women remain sedentary. By then, some theorists praised the positive social function vulnerable women performed in absorbing dangerous male sexual desire and thus protecting good girls. This connection should remind historians of the value of digital tools. By tracing the spatial dimensions of social patterns, they offer new ways of connecting those small-scale social patterns to large-scale cultural shifts. And to that conclusion, I had a brief addendum. One of the greatest challenges and frustrations of digital history is that you spend all your time putting your data on one platform before you realize that there's a better one. So I use Google Maps because it's so broadly familiar and it was so easily accessible, and I could envision students in the class I'm lecturing on mobility next semester to use these maps and build from them, participate in this project. It's also great, it's so great because you can edit it from multiple locations with multiple users, but at the same time, it's not so easy. Well, it's possible to overlay older maps on top of Google Maps, but it does take some time, and unfortunately not enough time before coming here to do it. But I thought I would end by saying that do as I say, not as I do, and invest some time and energy into looking into the platforms before you start plotting data, because once you start, it's so exciting to see where your historical actors are and to start drawing conclusions about the significance of their movements, but then you've got all of this data in one place that is not necessarily the best in terms of demonstrating the data and sharing it with other people. So I'll end on that caveat. Thank you.